So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Again, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining. My name is Angie Furman, and I'm the River Training Center Coordinator for RMS, and I'm going to be helping facilitate today's conversation and session on Section 7. Just to refamiliarize those of you and maybe introduce some of you to RMS. River Management Society is a national nonprofit, and our mission is to support professionals who study, protect, and manage North America's rivers. So we're the home of the River Training Center, the National Rivers Project, the River Studies and Leadership Certificate, and we have all sorts of events from River Ranger rendezvous to chapter trips, trainings and workshops. So I encourage you to go over to our website and take a peek at our calendar and stay up to date on what we've got going on. So I'd just like to go through a few things here. I'd like to point out we've got the chat here in Zoom. And so welcome you all to introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know a little bit about who you are, why you're joining us, where you work, anything that you'd like to share. And then I just want to set some expectations for this session, that this is meant to be interactive and that we're going to be going through some things together. So I really, again, encourage you to use that Zoom chat box. And also there's going to be opportunities for you to raise your hand, unmute, ask questions, things like that. I also want to introduce you all to this shared document. If you've joined some of the other sessions in the series, this might be a little familiar to you. If you click on that link I just put into the chat, it's going to open you up into a shared Word document here. And here at the top, you can go ahead and type in any questions that you might have as they come up today. We'll be referring back to this. It's anonymous. It's just a place to keep track of things. And then also towards the bottom, just building a resource list. So if there's anything that you'd like to share as far as resources that come up today, feel free to add any links or citations there. So again, you can go into this by clicking on the link in the chat box in Zoom and opening it up on a web browser on your computer. And I'll continuously post that link throughout today's session for anyone who might be joining. Also, we are recording today's session, and this will be sent out to everyone who's registered, as well as posted on our YouTube channel. If you haven't checked out our YouTube channel, we got tons of great videos. Encourage you to go check that out. And lastly, we do have a live transcript available, so you can show it or hide it by hitting the closed captions button on your Zoom toolbar. Just a few agreements as we're going through things today. Really encourage everyone to be here, be participating in this conversation. Also, we've got a lot of experts in the room, so please share your knowledge, and also love to see everyone's faces. It helps us feel not as lonely up here as the moderator and presenters. And so if possible, keep your camera on. Again, use that chat. One of my favorites, it's okay to be raggedy. We're working through these things together, and what's true today might not be true tomorrow. So just something to kind of keep in mind here as we're going through some scenarios and through some questions today. So again, I hope you're all here joining us to discuss a little bit about Section 7. Today, we're going to really delve into what defines a water resources project and when does Section 7 apply. We're also going to look at some of the decision-making factors used to evaluate water resources projects. I'm super excited to be joined today by Dave Cernicek and Kai Allen. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Dave and then Kai to introduce themselves.
Yeah. Alrighty. Hi, I'm David Cernicek. I work for the Bridger Teton National Forest out of Jackson Hole, Wyoming, as the Wild and Scenic Rivers Program Coordinator on the Snake River headwaters. designation. It's 416 miles, of which 315 miles fall on the national forest, and 13 streams and 27 sections of river or stream. And so it's a big animal. It's a watershed wide designation, and lots of private land interface and lots of county roads, highways, that type of thing. And people who have lots of money and like to do big projects, things like that. So we do a lot of Section 7 work, but glad to be here.
Hey, thanks, Dave. Good to see you. Good to see everybody else. My name is Kion. I work for the Bureau of Land Management in Southwestern Oregon on the Rogue National Wild and Scenic River. The Rogue was an instant river under the Act. It's a real class act and a multi-use river. A lot of things going on here on the Rogue, including recent additions to the river. 114 miles of 36 tributaries located on BLM land just recently added to the Rogue River system. So we too also have one of these watershed systems like the Snake River Headwaters designation. I worked for the BLM here on the Rogue for about 10 years. Prior to that, in my career, I worked for the Forest Service in a number of different places, in rivers and wilderness, winter sports, you name it, over the years. So glad to be here and glad you're here too. Thanks, Angie.
Thanks, Kai, and thanks, Dave. And I think we're gonna kind of real quick. We've learned a little bit about the presenters. We'd just like to learn a little bit more about you all and your experience. So I'm gonna launch a poll real quick. You should see it pop up on your screen. And we're just a little curious about what's your experience with Section 7. So maybe not very familiar or just starting to learn about it. Perhaps you've heard about it, but you haven't really worked on a Section 7 or been involved in one. Maybe you've been involved in one or a couple, or maybe you're an expert and you've done a whole bunch. So give you a few more seconds here to fill out this poll. And all right, I'm going to end it and share our results here. So it looks like we've got a nice spread of everyone. We've got, some people who are just starting to learn about it, some people who are a little familiar with it, but haven't really worked on one. Some that have been involved in a few, and another Section 7 expert in the room. Cool. Well, that is helpful. Thanks, everyone. And now I'm going to go ahead and stop share that and pass it over to Dave as we are going to kind of start delving into what is Section 7.
Sounds good, Angie. I'll try and not go too fast, which is one of my bad habits. But good to know where people are at on their knowledge levels. This is one of the most confusing things to get through that's actually really easy to understand once you get past the hard part. But we'll try and walk through some examples of water resources projects today. And later in this presentation, we'll do some real world stuff. These are projects that have potential to modify river channels. Examples include, but are not limited to, dams, water diversions, bridge crossings, boat ramps, channelization of the river, and stabilizing riverbanks. That's usually the biggest one. What is a water resources project? Water resources projects are defined in Forest Service regulations to mean any dam, water conduit, reservoir, powerhouse, transmission line, or other project works under the Federal Power Act or other construction of developments which would affect the free-flowing characteristics of a wild and scenic river or study river. This includes Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is FERC. I'll use that. Hydropower projects. FERC regulates other projects like gas pipelines and electric transmission lines that, depending on their location, may or may not be water resources projects. The Wild and Scenic Act defines free flowing as existing or flowing in a natural condition without impoundment, diversion, straightening, riprapping, or other modification of the waterway. Remember that free flowing is not defined as maintaining completely natural hydrologic cycles in a river system or maintaining a specific volume of water in a stream. Instead, free flowing means whatever the flow is in the channel is not being impeded by a man-made structure such as dams, artificial channels, diversions, or construction projects obstructing the flow. So yeah, it doesn't have to be free flowing from the headwaters to the ocean. It just, this section is not badly affected by the hand of man. Section 7 works to protect designated and congressionally authorized study streams by prohibiting new hydroelectric projects. Study streams is not something I come across very often in the West, but I guess they do exist in some places, so we still have to cover them. So they're kind of a weird animal. Section 7 also requires careful review and design of other projects to ensure that those projects protect and enhance river-related values. Values is stuff that gets really confusing as we go along here. The results of the Section 7 analysis process is a written assessment of how a project could affect river-related values. The river-related values that are analyzed include free-flowing condition, outstandingly remarkable values, and water quality. River classification has no effect on a Section 7 determination. The standards are not lower for projects or on segments classified as recreational versus segments that are scenic or wild. The protect and enhance mandate of the Act is interpreted as a non-degradation mandate, regardless of classification. The classification stuff is some of the most confusing thing to some people. No river is lesser because of its classification. It's just a classification. It's not how we manage it. The Wild and Scenic Rivers Act requires the river administering agency to evaluate a project and make the Section 7 determination. The outcome of the Section 7 analysis determines whether a federal agency can permit, fund, or assist with a water resources project. Free flowing definition: existing or flowing in a natural condition without impoundment, diversion, straightening, riprapping, or other modification of the waterway. Section 16 of the Act. ORV, outstandingly remarkable value, is a river-related value that is unique, rare, or exemplary when compared to other rivers at a regional or national scale. ORVs include scenic, recreational, geological, fish and wildlife, historical, cultural, or other similar values. On my designation, we have ecological that goes with wildlife. You can sort of mix and match a little bit if it makes sense. Even though there's a broad array of projects that could potentially harm river-related values, Section 7 does not automatically apply to all projects. Projects must go through a screening process to determine if Section 7 applies. Projects not falling under Section 7 must still follow other requirements of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act and other applicable laws and policy. Our discussion of factors that you should analyze will start with broad factors such as legal status of the river in question and how the federal government is to be involved in the project. Then we'll proceed to address the project-specific factors such as the type of project and project location. All of the following factors must be considered in determining whether a Section 7 applies to a proposed construction project. A simple yes or no to one or more of these factors isn't sufficient to decide whether a Section 7 applies. We'll talk about each of these factors in more detail in the coming slides. 1, does a project involve federal assistance? Could be money, permit, time, whatever. Is the project located in a river segment designated under Section 3A or Section 5A study river or Section 2A river? What is the project location relative to the protected river corridor? Is a project located upstream, downstream, or on a tributary of a wild and scenic river? Is the project a hydroelectric project licensed by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC? And finally, is the project a water resources project? And let's see. Does the project involve federal assistance? Usually pretty easy to figure out. Most things that are below the ordinary high water line require a permit from the Army Corps. Section 7 applies if the project involves any type of assistance from any federal agency. Federal assistance includes permits, funding, loans, grants, licenses, or technical assistance. If there is a federal assistance, Section 7 applies to projects proposed on both public and private land. Any assistance by an authorizing agency before, during, or after construction. The Act prohibits federal assistance to any project that is determined to not meet the standards to protect river-related values. Such assistance may include, but is not limited to, a license, preliminary permit, or other authorization granted by FERC, as well as licenses, permits, or other authorizations granted by the Corps of Engineers, and that's most cases, or the pursuant to the River and Harbors Act and Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. Assistance also includes federal funding of projects such as state highway proposals and activities of your own federal agency. We are also bound by the rules. First factor that you should analyze to determine whether Section 7 applies is the status of the river under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Section 7 applies only when a proposed project has the potential to affect certain types of rivers identified under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Section 7 protections apply to all designated rivers in the National Wild and Scenic River System. Section 7 also applies to all congressionally authorized study rivers for varying periods of time. This distinction between designated and study rivers, which evaluation standard is used. The distinction is discussed later. Section 7 does not apply to rivers identified for study by agencies. These are rivers that have been determined to be eligible or suitable under the analysis framework of your agencies, their land and resources management plan. However, it is important to note that while Section 7 does not apply to these rivers, each agency has their own policies to protect them while they are being considered by the agency for inclusion into the national system. Section 7 applies whether the river is classified as wild, scenic, or recreational. No difference. They're all the same. Weird slide here, but okay. Designated river is by Congress, apply Section 7. Section 5A river, congressionally authorized study river. It's only for a certain amount of time that we apply Section 7. We act like it's a designated one. Section 5DI river, an agency authorized study river. No, Section 7 does not apply. And you want to fall back onto, the resource management plan to figure out what you're doing and figure out what the river-related values you are protecting. Each agency has a management plan to help you in directing that. Let's see. Examples of federal assistance for projects include, but are not limited to, a license, permit, preliminary permit, or other authorization granted by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is required to provide authorization for non-federal hydropower projects and interstate gas pipelines. It also has limited authority over interstate electric transmission lines. Assistance also includes a permit or authorization from the Department of the Army for work in a stream, channels, or wetlands pursuant to the River and Harbors Act and Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. The latter are commonly called a Section 404 or dredge and fill permit. Federal assistance also includes federal funding of projects such as state highways. The state may be doing the project, but it's using federal highways money. There are many projects on non-federal lands that involve no federal assistance, such as construction projects funded by state and local governments or projects completely funded by private parties on private lands. If the project you're considering involves no federal assistance, then your analysis is complete and Section 7 processes are not required. If the project does not involve federal assistance, then you should proceed to address the next factor to see if Section 7 applies. On the project location, and we ask, what is the project location relative to the protected river corridor? To analyze this factor, you'll need a map showing the exact project location and the exact boundary locations of the protected stream corridor. You also need a excuse me. You'll also need a map of the larger watershed in which the protected stream corridor is located. With those maps in hand, then you need to answer the two questions on the screen. Keep in mind that even if only a portion of the footprint of a project falls within the protected stream corridor, or upstream, downstream, on a tributary to or on a 5A study river that contains a protected stream segment, Section 7 analysis may be required. Recall that Section 5A refers to congressional study rivers. Let's continue on our discussion of factor 3. If the answer to the two location questions on the previous slide is no, then Section 7 does not apply to the project. If the answer to either of the two location questions is yes, then save the results of your location analysis. You should note whether the project is within the protected stream or within the overall watershed or the protected stream corridor. The exact location will be used later to determine if Section 7 applies, and if so, what project evaluation standards will be used. Let's see. This one up. Okay. The Federal Power Commission, now known as FERC, shall not license the construction of any dam, water conduit, reservoir, powerhouse, transmission line, or other project works under the Federal Power Act. Is a project hydroelectric project licensed by federal? Okay, is a project a hydroelectric project licensed by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC? What do you guys think? Is that going to need a Section 7? That would be no Section 7 required. That means a newly constructed hydropower project is not allowed within a designated river or congressionally authorized study river. We're not going to put, that's the easiest part of the whole wild and scenic thing, is you don't put up dams in the wild and scenic river. Even if a project isn't within a protected corridor, it is not allowed to directly affect a protected river corridor. Get help on these things if you need. Hydropower projects also apply to uplands within wild and scenic river corridors, not just below the ordinary high water mark of the river. Project facilities such as pipelines and transmission lines may also occupy upland areas. Things get weird when you get into FERC stuff. Water resources project is any project that involves construction below the ordinary high water mark of the river or stream. That, if you take anything home today, that's it. Anything below the ordinary high water mark of the river or stream, you got it. Ordinary high water mark is a site-specific determination that is based on both physical and biological evidence of the landscape. General features used to delineate the ordinary high water mark are relatively stable over time and reflect long-time flow patterns rather than the recent flow conditions or individual flow events. Ordinary high water mark is generally consistent with multiple indicators. The topographic break in slope, typically the tops of the channel banks, change in sediment characteristics, texture, soil development, and change in vegetation characteristics, density, maturity, species, composition. Ordinary high water mark should be correlated with two or more of these indicators whenever possible, as indications can be misleading when used individually and without consideration of the other indicators. The Army Corps of Engineers has produced a technical reference that is extremely useful in identifying location of the ordinary high water mark. A good rule of thumb is to ask whether any portion of the project will ever get wet. Considering changing flow regimes over multiple years, even if only a portion of the project will get wet, such as the bottom of a piling for a bridge, the entire project is considered a water resources project. In addition, even if the project involves only temporary construction and occupancy of a stream channel, it's considered a water resources project. If it has anything to do with FERC, get help. If you're not a water pro, get help. Let's see. If you can find the ordinary high water mark on this, you're fine by yourself. Otherwise, get help. Okay, and then we'll move into an activity. To help you understand what we mean by ordinary high water mark, we have provided this three-dimensional block diagram. The width and elevation of the channel boundaries are marked with dotted lines. The ordinary high water mark is marked by a blue line. The main channel always has base flow, whereas the secondary channel is ephemeral and only flows in response to storm events. The active channel boundaries of the main and secondary channels are the top of the natural levee. The top of the natural levee is the same elevation as the ordinary high water mark. When the flows rise above the natural levee, the flow is not contained within a channel and the flow spreads across a floodplain. The floodplain would be considered to be above and beyond the high water mark because it is higher elevation than the natural channel. So we're going to take on some examples here. Number one, what do you think? Is that below the ordinary high water line?
Hold on, let me go back.
No, you already showed them?
Yeah.
Oh, you ruined everything.
I was showing them as you were going through.
Okay. All right, if you still have them up there, that's fine.
Okay.
Okay, what do you guys think? Is number one below the ordinary high water mark? It is. How about two?
I don't know if I have the same example as you, Dave. I'm not sure if I'm looking at the right thing.
Yeah, I think you are. Are the
Oh.
numbers up there?
Not all at
Number
the
two?
same.
One is on,
Yeah, one is below the ordinary high water mark. Two is outside, is not below the ordinary high water mark. Three is below the ordinary high water mark. Four is not. And five is not.
I don't think these are correlating. So
Are you sure? It should be like across the
Mhm.
screen, it should be like 2, 4, then 5 up top, then
Oh,
one
yeah,
below
there
that.
we go.
Yeah. All right, we'll move on and hope nobody noticed. Okay. Let's move on to the next one. Examples of projects below ordinary high water mark. Dams, bridges, pilings, and riverbanks. Let's see what we got here. One's a kayak park project that places boulders in a channel to create boating features for kayakers. What do you think? Is that the section 7 material there? Is that below the ordinary high water mark? Yes, it is. It's in the water. It redirects flow. Absolutely would need a section 7. What do we got up on the far right? And oh, that's Idaho. That's on the South Fork of the Snake, Conant boat ramp. Boating dock and parking area for vehicles would be considered a water resources project because a portion of the boat dock would be below the ordinary high water mark. And finally, a road construction project located completely in the uplands, but still within the predicted stream corridor would not be considered a water resources project. We good on that one?
All right.
Okay.
Now we're gonna play a game. I'm gonna put a link in the chat box here to a Mentimeter game, but I'm also going to share this here so you can go to menti.com and enter the code 24582458. You can click the link in the chat. That'll get you into our Mentimeter game here. Just to get the juices flowing again and make sure we have a good solid understanding of, is this a water resources project? So giving it another minute here as people are joining in. Again, you can click the link in the chat. You can use the QR code over here and scan it with your phone, or go to menti.com and enter the code 24582458. All right. Well, we're gonna go ahead and I see we got some people in here. So this is gonna be a game testing you to see if you are quick on your toes and understand if it's a water resources project. It's going to give a scenario, and then you're going to choose whether yes or no, whether it is or isn't a water resources project. So we're going to go ahead and get started here. We've got first question of 4. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Is this a water resources project? A boat ramp? All right, everyone was quick. Looks like we got everyone got that right. Awesome. Yes, that is a water resources project. Let's see who got it the quickest here. This is where we had some fun into this. Get a little competitive if you like. St. Elmo in the top spot. All right. Yeah. Nice, Royce. Nice job, Royce. Okay. Question number 2. A fuels reduction project within a designated river corridor and above the ordinary high water mark. Is that a water resources project, yes or no? And time is up. Yep, that is correct. No, it is not a water resources project. So nice job, everyone. So after that, ooh, it's getting close. We've got St. Elmo still in the lead here. All right, 2 more questions. A bridge replacement that crosses designated river, and the bridge piers and abutments, or the supports to be replaced, are below the ordinary high water mark. Nicely done. Yes, that is a water resources project. And we've got a new leader, Thinky, in first place. All right, Thinky. So last question. This is for all the marbles. A fisheries habitat improvement within a congressionally authorized study area with an in-stream rock weir below the ordinary high water mark. Yes, that is a water resources project. All right, let's see the final results here. And we've got Thinky. Thinky is our winner. Good job, Thinky. So this is just really to just reemphasize, you know, when you are starting to deal or delve into section 7, like, is it a water resources project? Think about some of these things before you start going down a wrong path, you know. So with that, gonna go back to our presentation here. We're going to go back into some of the analysis standards now, and I'm going to pass it over to Kai.
Hey, thanks, Angie, and thanks, Dave, for that. Yeah, so we learned about federal assistance, and we learned about whether it's a water resources project or not, and kind of how you approach those different questions that you ask when you're looking at a project in your river corridor on your congressional study river. So Dave, thanks again for that. So the next section, what we're going to talk about is the actual standards that you apply to your project and to your Section 7, and it is related to the type of project that you're working on, but also its location. So these are the Section 7 evaluation standards that come from both Section 7A and Section 7B of the Act. Okay, so apply Section 7. There's a bunch of different tools that you look at when you're asking yourself this question about what part of the Act actually applies. And first you want to look at the language of the Act itself, Section A and 7B, and think through that part of the legislation. Another piece where you'd want to go to answer this question is your own agency regulation and policy. So for example, BLM manual, which is the manual that we use for wild and scenic rivers here in BLM, 6400, has some really valuable guidance that can help you sort of figure this out as you're going through and thinking about your project. Next, you want to know if there's any special legislative provisions that Congress put into the designation. A good example of that is here from the Rogue, where I work. We had some recent additions to the Rogue Wild and Scenic River, and Congress in the legislation did a pretty interesting thing. They designated, I think, 5 or 6 additional streams that they're not wild and scenic rivers, but they essentially have Section 7 protections, and only certain projects are allowed to go forward on these streams. And if you didn't know that, if you hadn't gone back and read the legislation and took a look at that, you wouldn't know. You'd try to apply Section 7 and you'd go, wait, this doesn't seem quite right here, because Section 7 itself, as described in the original Act itself, wouldn't apply to these projects. The next thing that's really, really helpful for you in kind of discerning how to apply Section 7 is the guidance that's provided by the Interagency Wild and Scenic Rivers Coordinating Council. And there's a great white paper that's super helpful as a reference on Section 7, as well as some other tools there on the council's website. So there's appendices that go through the different standards in the white paper. And then there's also a flow chart. And we're going to talk a little bit about this later. This is the flow chart. That's really helpful as a tool to help you identify what your project is and what standards that you need to apply. So like we talked about, Section 7A and Section 7B breaks this part of the Act in half, essentially. In Section 7A, the language of 7A applies to designated rivers and also those state nominated rivers. They're state wild and scenic rivers that were designated under Section 2A2 of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So Section 7A standards apply to designated rivers, whereas Section 7B of the Act applies to the other kinds of rivers that are in study. So Section 5A, congressionally authorized study rivers, like Dave talked about, but also those candidate Section 2A2 rivers that are in process. They're under study with the Secretary of the Interior and the state governor. Oh, Angie, can you go back a slide there? Yeah, thanks. And so Section 7 applies whether you're within the corridor or you're upstream or downstream of the segment. Great, thanks. Next slide. So the first one that we talk about, the first kind of standard that we apply is on or directly affecting. And this applies directly to FERC hydropower projects that would be in your Wild and Scenic River Corridor or the study area. So if it's a FERC project, if it's a hydroelectric project under the Federal Power Act, Rivers and Harbors Act, it is on or directly affecting the segment of river, it's strictly prohibited. And it applies to all those components associated with a FERC license. So water lines, access roads, and although some pipelines and some transmission, electrical transmission is not necessarily prohibited outright when you're dealing with a FERC project. And what I would say, if you're working on a FERC project, you'd probably know it on your river. And I think, as Dave so clearly stated, seek professional guidance. FERC can be really complex. I've only worked a little bit on a FERC project, and my association with that was pretty tangential. There was a specialist in the Forest Service who was strictly working on that project all the time, and so I deferred a lot to her. So that's FERC, on or directly affecting. So then once you've kind of gone through that and you know that you're not dealing with a FERC project, these are the 3 evaluation standards that you apply. Direct and adverse effects, invade or unreasonably diminish, and then invade the area or diminish. Those are kind of the 3 standards, and each one applies, and it depends on the type of project and the location of your project. Location becomes really, really important in going through these 3 standards. So we'll go on to the next slide and take a look at each standard individually and see if we can't pick apart an understanding of how these work. Okay, so the first one is direct and adverse effects. It applies to your designated river or a 2A2 designated river, as well as Section 5A congressional study rivers. So 7A and 7B use the same language associated with the standard direct and adverse effects. And one of the things that's important to think about with this one is it also applies to those tributaries that are located inside the corridor boundaries. So this can be confusing for folks. So if you have a project that's on a tributary, but it's inside the designated boundary, or the interim boundary, if you don't have final boundaries yet, you apply the direct and adverse effect standard. And you're determining direct and adverse effects on the free-flowing condition of the river, its water quality, and then each of the outstandingly remarkable values, and the condition is baselined to the time of designation. So it's the conditions of the river at the time of designation. And then another important part of thinking through this is you look at your river management plan and really reference those outstandingly remarkable value definitions that are from your CRMP. So that's what you're analyzing against, is those ORV definitions, whether or not you're having both direct and adverse effects. Here's the language right from 7A on direct and adverse effects. What you'll notice here is it's not an outright prohibition. Projects can occur in designated wild and scenic rivers, but they just must not have direct and adverse effects. And there's no balancing or weighing these effects. So either you're having a direct and adverse effect on a value or you are not. And you can't, under Section 7, you can't say, well, yeah, this value, we're gonna have some adverse effects to recreation, but we're improving water quality over here, or we're improving fish habitat over here, right? So there's no balancing, weighing of these values. It's sort of all or the above, kind of a go, no-go standard. Okay, so that was direct and adverse effects. The next one that the next standard that you consider, depending on the type of project, but especially where it's located, is invade the area or unreasonably diminish. And this standard applies to projects that are located upstream or downstream of your wild and scenic river, or they're located on a tributary to your designated wild and scenic river corridor. So invade the area and unreasonably diminish. And this language is put in the act essentially to prevent dams upstream or downstream, particularly downstream of a segment, to actually back up into the designated section of river. So that's what invade means. Or the project would encroach or somehow intrude upon the free-flowing condition of that designated segment. And then the next section of this is diminishment. And diminishment, this standard's really interesting because it says unreasonably diminish. So you can have some diminishment, and Congress recognized that there are projects that were already in existence or may be constructed that would diminish values, but that diminishment can't be unreasonable. And then lastly with this standard, and this is really important, the values that you apply to unreasonable diminishment are scenery, recreation, fish, and wildlife values that were in the area at the time that the river was designated. So under this standard, you're not necessarily looking at your outstandingly remarkable values, which you would under the direct and adverse standard, but you are considering recreation, scenery, fish, and wildlife values that were present at the time of designation. So this is the language here right from the act itself. And what I want to point out here is that this standard really relies on professional judgment. So what does unreasonably diminish actually mean? And that is the discretion of the river managing agency to determine exactly what unreasonable diminishment is. And in trying to understand that, you would say, look at trends and conditions of these values. Or you might ask yourself, was scenery, recreation, fish, or wildlife one of the outstandingly remarkable values for which the river was designated? And then what are the trend of that value? So for example, like let's say fish. You're looking at the fish condition, but you're also comparing that and benchmarking that to the condition of the fishery in the designated segment. Let's say if it was a project, a dam project or something like that, 40, 50 miles upriver of your segment. And thinking about whether or not that diminishment is unreasonable or not. There's a historic project here on the Rogue that's pretty interesting. There was a dam proposed called the Elk Creek Dam, and it's a pretty fascinating story about river management, but it was ultimately the BLM and Forest Service's Section 7 determination that that decided that there would be unreasonable diminishment to the fisheries ORV in the designated section from the Elk Creek Dam project. And eventually the Elk Creek Dam was decommissioned, notched, and decommissioned because of the guidance in Section 7. Next slide. So we talked about invade and unreasonably diminish, and we talked about direct and adverse. And the third standard is invade or diminish. And this standard specifically applies, it's from Section 7B, and it specifically applies to those rivers that are under study. So Section 5A congressional studies, or Section 2A2 rivers that are candidate rivers. They are also under evaluation to be studied. And you'll notice in this one that unreasonable is removed from the standard. And so Congress, when it created the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, it wanted to have a higher standard while those rivers are under study. And each one have certain time periods associated with the study, but there can be no project that would invade or diminish those values for which the river is being studied. And it applies to projects, again, that are upstream, downstream, or on a tributary to the study corridor itself. And we see again that it applies to these four values: recreational, scenery, fish, and wildlife values at the date of study designation. So it's at the start that the study was commissioned. Okay, next slide. Most of us are going to be dealing with this direct and adverse standard. So if you work on a designated river, direct and adverse is probably the standard that you're going to interact with the most. And again, just in summary, you're looking at effects to water quality, the free-flowing condition of the segment, and those outstandingly remarkable values for federally assisted projects that are located below the ordinary high water mark and also on tributaries within the corridor. So it's that notion that the corridor boundary, any projects that are inside the corridor boundary, direct and adverse. Whereas for a designated river, invade or unreasonably diminish is applied to those projects upriver, downriver, on a tributary, at the time of designation, outside of the corridor at the time of designation. And you look at scenery, recreational, fish and wildlife values is the standard that you look at under invade and unreasonably diminish. This is a really helpful tool. So this was generated by the Interagency Wild and Scenic Rivers Coordinating Council, and it's really, really helpful. This is what's called the Section 7 flow chart, and it can really help you understand what your project is. This can get pretty confusing, and so definitely refer folks to this checklist as a reference when you're trying to understand your project. And while we're here, Angie, so I want to point out another feature of this checklist. Again, it shows 2 bright red stop signs for FERC. And FERC projects have their own separate checklist as referred to here. You can see referred to the flow chart for FERC hydro projects. And that's actually available online. I'm not sure if Angie shared the link or not, but there is a separate flow chart for FERC projects that is, I think it's the Department of Energy, I believe, is the department that manages that flow chart. But definitely use this. Okay, next slide. And that's it for the evaluation standards. We're on to a case study and back to Dave. Thanks.
And as Kai was mentioning, some of those resources like that white paper from the Interagency Wild and Scenic Rivers Coordinating Council and the flow chart, I've added to that resources list just to remind you here on our shared document. You can also type in any questions, but some good things here. I'll put in the title there in a second, but yeah, so resources you can refer back to. All right, go ahead, Dave.
All righty. I am back. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So I think we're moving into an example today of a real life thing that happened. And this is something that occurred on the Snake River here in Wyoming. And this has to do with an emergency situation that we got into years ago. And sort of take you through the steps. It's a little bit more of an advanced situation, but it's something that does come up. And we do have emergencies on rivers and stuff that is very, very high pressure. And so using this for an example today. But first thing to know is that Wyoming's not done yet. It's still forming at all times, and we have a lot of landslides around here. The earth still moves and recreates itself, and it gets really interesting sometimes. Around 2011, I got a call that we had a major slide in the Snake River Canyon, which is one of our more popular sections of river in the West. We do about 200,000 people in about 2 months' time, mostly on 8 miles of class 3 whitewater. And this was May, and it was still kind of stormy out, still kind of cold out, still kind of snowy out, and things were changing. It was high water time, and the river was definitely up, lots of flood water, and got the call that had a major slide, the highway is completely blocked, and the river was completely blocked, which was something that I'd never heard of by that point of happening on the Snake, that it was fully dammed. When a landslide comes down, generally it can block the river. It doesn't last for a very long time, from my experience. And if you can see on the screen, not the best of photos, but yeah, this was after a little bit of cleanup, but the highway itself was completely blocked. And let's go to the next slide. And this is more of what it looked like when I got down there. They were first trying to get the highway unblocked. This was a big blob of moving earth that it may not look like it's moving, but it was moving. Very, very slowly, but it was moving. It's kind of weird to watch. But this was the double draw slide. Directly down from here is what's called the Blue Trail slide. And the Blue Trail slide has been significantly altered over the years because it was it's kind of a weird setup in that when they were trying to redo and reconstruct the Snake River Highway, there was not much that they could find to put the highway on. When they really started taking it apart and figuring out the engineering, there's never been anything great to keep the highway up against the cliff and functioning. When they rebuilt the highway, it was kind of like the highway's on what pretty much looks like golf tees, these long and big piece of engineering pieces that hold the bed of the highway up, but pretty much go down below the river to find bedrock that's solid enough to hold the highway up. And so double draw had never run before. It was, two draws up there, up in the hills there. One ran water, one ran mud, and they both joined together and just brought all this huge amount of stuff coming down the river. And not coming down the river, coming down the draw. And as I said, it blocked the river, blocked the road, blocked everything, and really moved the river around. And we lost some river features, we gained some river features. It was kind of exciting, but what were we going to do with it next? Highway Department of Transportation, are engineers are good guys and they think they're pretty smart, but their first response is like, let's just keep pushing, let's just push the rest of it off into the river, because that's where it was headed for anyways. That's not really great for us in the from the jobs we do and the impacts we're trying not to have happen. And so it's kind of delicate here. This is Highway 89. It goes from, Jackson, Wyoming to the south to what's called Star Valley, and we have two main roads that come in and out of Jackson Hole that are imperative to us, that go to bedroom communities where people can actually afford to live. And those are all the people that do all the jobs in Jackson Hole, whether it's everything from the entire service industry, whether it's making beds or clearing tables or being any service job, being a raft guide, doing anything. We have about 10 to 12,000 people coming up and down the Snake River Canyon twice a day, or going up and over Teton Pass twice a day. And so this is a major hub here. This is a big deal. To have this road closed, the people who live down in Star Valley, to go around this involves going over Teton Pass, then over Pine Creek Pass, and that's about a 3-hour drive that they don't normally do. And gas at this time was over $4 a gallon, and people were pretty excited about having the highway closed. And it got uglier from there. People who had dogs in all day, or kids they had to pick up from daycare by 6 o'clock, or they started getting charged, $100 an hour, that type of stuff. So this turned out to be a really, really emotional thing. And there we are as Wild and Scenic River managers. Let's go to the next slide. So dealing with the landslide wasn't too bad. We started figuring out how we're going to, get all the material out of there, all that was going to happen. But WYDOT folks came back. They said, we've got a big deal because we think the river's the river's been moved over to the river left, and it's coming back now, and it's hidden this one main piece here. You can sort of see it in the picture, and it's going to undermine our highway. And our highway is going to we think end up falling into the river, and we're going to be out of highway, and it's going to be, tens of millions of dollars and blah, blah, blah. And from there on out, pretty much, this road services people who live in Idaho and Wyoming. So we had congressmen from 2 states, governors from 2 states, everybody influential from 2 states, calling and screaming at us, more than hourly. And so huge amount of pressure to just get her done and do whatever you have to get this road back open. Everybody's upset. And how can you be true to the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act on something like this? Did have coworkers that were like, no, we need to do this right. We need to, make this back into the most, we need to bring this river bank back to, what it originally was, this and that. And it's going to take some time. We need to bring in experts, and we'll get it figured out, but we're going to put this right. And so quite a bit of internal back and forth, pushing and screaming and trying to figure out what to do. Big thing is people were getting angry. And so what could we do to get this done, get it done right, be true to the act, and find the solution that works for everybody. Let's see, what's the next slide? Yeah, here's another view in the next slide of it. Kind of, it's right below those 2 trees in the middle of the slope there. They basically want to bring in a huge wall of giant boulders and install those there. At the bottom of the photo here, you can see sort of kind of the tail ends of the bottom downstream end of where the double draw landslide that got us into this trouble is. So, immediately started trying to crank out a Section 7 as we're trying to figure out a plan. And it was kind of the 24-hour Section 7, make it happen. What I did was immediately was start trying to figure out the past of what this piece of roadway and this piece of bank really was about. And one of the real positive things we did in writing our CRMP, our management plan, especially with this section of river, is coming to terms that we have a lot of infrastructure out there, and there is other people with infrastructure out there that sometimes there's got to be a little bit of wiggle room when there's irreplaceable infrastructure out there. We can't just not do something about it and say, sorry, Wild and Scenic Rivers Act takes precedence here, and we're going to have to sit here and lose $2 million, $5 million, $10 million worth of infrastructure because of a congressional act. We left some room to deal with infrastructure things, or we also left room to deal with like log jams in places like this huge highway, this huge highly trafficked piece of river, where we do get strainers sometimes and the ability to take strainers out. But what we could figure out is people were getting very, very angry about this, that they were starting to really not like Wild and Scenic. What I was able to find is that this little piece of whatever is not really a riverbank. It's been dug up. It has more stuff in it that's been going on for 80 years than I could ever believe. It's got vents, it's got sensors, it's got pipes, it's got, you name it. And yeah, all that rocky material there has been dumped down there, but it is full of stuff. It is not a normal riverbank. It is not a pristine riverbank. It is something that just sort of, it's a bunch of stuff built in there that had a bunch of rocks dumped over it. And so starting from a place like that made it a little bit easier to start trying to figure out how we're going to untie this knot. Here's a couple more photos of it. If you go to the next slide. One's looking upstream. You can still see part of the slide there that didn't wash out. And you can kind of see where one of the machines is that ultimately went down to deal with it. And then just another divot on the right there where it was starting to eat away. And so, yeah, proposing to mainly put a huge giant boulder rock wall there, as they always prefer to do. And so, yeah, let's look at here on the flow chart. What we have here. Does this project include federal assistance for construction? such as a permit. Yeah, this is a one, it's on the national forest. Two, it was going to take federal highway dollars to make it happen. Had to be a section 7. Don't let people talk you out of not doing a section 7 because it's on federal lands. Don't let them talk you out of it because it's emergency. You still have to do your paperwork if you want to stay out of court. Is it hydropower? No, it's not. Is the activity of water resources project? What do we got? We have a federal nexus. We have work below the ordinary high water line. Absolutely it is. And so this is a direct and adverse effect standard. There are going to be effects to free flowing conditions, water quality, all those good things. So yeah, we had to do a section 7 on this. We had to do one very, very quickly. And how are we going to do this? The best idea I had to deal with this. Let's go to the next slide. As I said before, guess I already covered this. This was not an emergency. This was not pristine. There's not time to do it right. Wild and Scenic and agency could not have been more unpopular at the time. And really, yeah, the phone calls we took every few minutes were really brutal and threatening. And the best thing I could think of was, what if we just let WYDOT do what they want right now and wait till the pressure's off, and then we make WYDOT do what we want them to do. It's not going to be perfect. We're not going to have a something beautiful come out of this, but we can get it back to what it was before the landslide, at least in appearance. And that's basically what we did. Go to the next slide, probably. And yeah, we let them build a road down there, and we let them bring in a bunch of rock, and told them not to spend all that money, put in their little road, because they were going to go back in there. They quickly took the road out, thinking we'd never make them go back in there and have to build it again. We made them go back in there. And so we got the road open. We got everybody going back and forth to work again. We got, people got their dog messes on their carpet cleaned up. They got their kids' daycare fines paid off. Life went on again. Summer came. We didn't have a highway closed all summer. Life went back to normal. We didn't get beat up too bad over that. And we let it go for a little over a year. And then, we came back to them with a plan, and this is what we want done. And we set things back right. And that was our plan. They did as we asked. They weren't happy about it. They didn't think we'd ever make them do it, but we did. And that was not a lot of time to figure all that stuff out. I was pretty proud of what we got to with that, because I don't think we could have done anything any better. But we did a pretty good job on that one, and it can be done. Don't let anybody talk you out of not doing the right thing just because there's a lot of pressure there. I think probably wrote that section 7 in under 24 hours. And there's a lot of contentious things going on there. But as I said, it wasn't the perfect answer, but it was the perfect answer for us. And we got it done. Things are sort of back to pretty much what they looked like before it happened. And still there's a lot of rock there, but it's not this giant pile of discolored rocks, things like that. And it wasn't ever going to be a pristine bank ever again, since, it hasn't been a pristine bank since a highway was put in there in the 30s. So that's an example of a emergency section 7 that I wanted to share with you. And I'll transfer it back to Kai. You're on duty, Kai.
Hey, Dave, thanks for that. Yeah, appreciate that. Yeah, it's a great example on, emergency situations where you have to act fast. And I think it's really valuable to kind of consider preparedness. So these things happen on our rivers, and the more prepared you are, more kind of familiar with your plan and what your ORVs are, and your familiarity with section 7, things like that can really help you when you're kind of in a situation like that, where you have to act fast and prepare an emergency section 7. And it's a good segue into talking about outcomes. So what exactly happens in a section 7 determination? What are the outcomes of this process? So as you go through your Section 7 determination, if your project has an adverse effect, or you think it's going to have an adverse effect, what do you do? How do you coordinate this with the other agencies? And a few points I think are really important. Project consultation and coordination. So I really strongly emphasize that when projects are coming up or on your radar screen, you are informed of them. Is get involved with project consultation coordination. So kind of that pre-application, pre-NEPA process. Also thinking about that coordination during implementation, during project implementation. So these are the responsibilities of the river, of us, the river administering agency, and how we interact with those other federal or perhaps state authorities. You want to think about the project timing and identify your information needs. And as much as possible, if you can do that up front when the project is still in the development stage, you can really, really help yourself down the road in not getting to a project that actually has direct and adverse effects. So if you do a good job up front, you can sort of avoid that challenge. We evaluate the water resources project, and then the next role that we have in this process is to actually complete and transmit the determination. So there's basically 3 outcomes out of Section 7. And the first one, oh, I like that. The first one is whether or not your project has direct and adverse effects, or in this case, adverse effects. And that's essentially a red light situation. The law has no wiggle room. It's a pass-fail approach. So if you have adverse effects, the project cannot go forward. And then the second outcome of this is that there are adverse effects, but the river administering agency may suggest some avoidance measures that if say the Army Corps implemented those avoidance measures, then the project could go forward. So adverse effects with avoidance measures is kind of a yellow light situation. So like if the Corps adopts those avoidance measures, they go back, they rework their project, integrate those design features into their project design, and redo the Section 7, then it can come back to the agency and hopefully not have adverse effects. And then the last outcome, of course, is that there are no direct and adverse effects, or invade, unreasonably diminish effects, whatever the standard is, and the project can go forward. You continue through the process and you transmit the decision to the federal agency that is assisting with the project. It's basically a pass-fail approach under Section 7. So let's talk a little bit about avoidance and mitigation and how that works. So there is no mitigation that's allowed for under Section 7. And this is a little bit different than some other laws that we're familiar with out there that allow for either agency discretion or sort of some wiggle room. So you see language in other laws, Department of Transportation Act, for example, that allows for feasible and prudent alternatives, other ways that projects can go forward. But with Section 7, it's basically a pass-fail. Yeah, and compensation is a really good point to talk about. So there's no offsite compensation. So if you're going to have direct and adverse, the project kind of comes to a halt. It cannot be approved. And you also can't minimize effects to sort of make those projects smaller, but that they're still you're still violating the standard, that there is still direct and adverse or unreasonable diminishment. So there's no minimization criteria. So what happens if the project doesn't meet the standard? Well, hopefully you don't get there. You've coordinated, you've done consultation, you're working in parallel with all the other agencies and the proponent at the same time, but it does happen that the project doesn't meet the standard. And so Congress anticipated this, and they put some language there in section 7 about what happens when a particular project doesn't meet the standard. Essentially, the authorizing agency, the proposing agency, writes a letter to Congress, notifies the Secretaries of Interior and Agriculture, sends a letter to Congress for a written request to basically act, to authorize or appropriate funds for the project, but they must include an explanation of how the project is in conflict with the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And there's only been a couple times where this has happened. And one of them is kind of a famous case study from the St. Croix Wild and Scenic River. And this was that famous bridge across the St. Croix Wild and Scenic River that was going to have direct and adverse effects. And I believe on that one, Congress eventually modified the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act to allow this bridge to be constructed. So section 7 evaluation helps to advance projects that protect and enhance river values. And I dragged out a couple of photos here from the Rogue Wild and Scenic River to sort of demonstrate this concept of that section 7 just helps us make better projects. It's not necessarily all of a regulatory structure. You work with other agencies and partner to create good outcomes. So here on the Rogue, this photograph on the left is a picture of a water diversion. This is an agricultural pump underneath this log, and the BLM worked with the proponent to camouflage the water pump, and it looks great. You can hardly notice this thing when you float by it. It's really an example of a great project. And then on the other side is an example of a project that maybe didn't come out so well in terms of thinking about river values. This is a vault toilet at a boat ramp. The entire boat ramp goes underwater when the boat ramp floods. And we have to be really careful to ensure that we pump this vault and take care of the vault so that when the river rises, that it doesn't go underwater. Obviously, through the section 7 determination, possibly some better design standards could have been included for this project. But ultimately, that's what section 7 is about, trying to protect and enhance those river values and meet the intent of the act. Hey, I see Steve's got his hand up there. Angie, you want to
Yeah,
see what Steve's question is? Hey, Steve.
go ahead, Steve.
Hey, everybody. I don't want to hijack. You don't have too much time, but I'm just wondering if you guys are starting your consulting fees after 12:30, because I've got a million questions.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, Steve, look me up anytime. And good to see you. And yeah, we're going to try to speed through the rest of these slides here and just kind of transition into an open forum for folks. So.
Okay, yeah, I just have some obviously some stupid questions because I'm a little light on some details, but adverse effects is such a heavy duty term, and how do we actually work through those, because it's hard to see how humans can do anything in here and not have an adverse effect, and so but yeah, I'll let you guys keep going, and I'll save my questions here.
Cool. Yeah, we'll come back to that, Steve. Yeah, it's a good question. So thinking just a little bit about outcomes here and wrapping this up. So here's a project example from the Trinity Wild and Scenic River here, located in Northern California. And obviously a project like this has some short-term effects to river values, to water quality. This was a fisheries restoration project where they're trying to reconnect the river channel to its floodplain and create fish habitat for fish. So some short-term negative effects to outstandingly remarkable values or water quality, but those long-term benefits to the fishery ORV in this case are significant. This is a river where coho salmon are listed as endangered. So that's a positive outcome from going through a section 7 determination. Next slide. And here too, again, we see an example where the Section 7 determination process itself can really benefit river values. So in this example, it's a bridge replacement, and recreation was an outstandingly remarkable value. And so in the bridge replacement, removing those bridge piers from the channel, which were essentially blocking free-flowing conditions of the river, and creating a bridge design that's passed through with no abutments in the river channel really helps to advance the purpose of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So we're protecting and enhancing river values and making things better. Great. So yeah, just a quick summary here. Angie, let's just kind of go through these and leave a few minutes to pick up any questions and have some chat.
Yeah, I agree. I think just getting to some questions here and some chat.
Great. So yeah, we wanted to talk a little bit about how it really works. What are your experiences out there? Has Section 7's been easy, difficult, confusing, challenging?
Steve, also any, like, for example, now's a good time to ask your question.
Yeah, I feel like I'm going to go to jail in some ways because I mean, we have so many things that it seems that a lot of projects have kind of never gone through a Section 7. I mean, I'm working on the Rogue here. I mean, I have, the burning thing we have right now is like we have boat ramps, right, that have been put in that basically need cleaned all the time. And so I feel that we just have projects that are sort of uncharacterized on a Section 7 that I'd like to kind of just start down that road. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know where to start, but that's really our current biggest thing right now is that we have several very busy boat ramps on the Rogue, Wild and Scenic, that are kind of critical to outfitters and guides, just general public accessing the water, and some of them are just true and functional because we really have to get in there on a regular basis. And when Dave was talking about, you have a piece of infrastructure that was built in a Wild and Scenic River, and then things happen, right? Mother Nature comes along and delivers essentially a bunch of sediment to a boat ramp, and then now this piece of infrastructure is not usable. So where how do you restore that and still keep your Wild and Scenic values? And that's where my questions kind of go is the adverse effects. Are we looking at adverse effects for, let's say, the scenic section of the Wild Rogue, and then another ramp is in the recreational section, so you're kind of tolerating infrastructure in some way? So that's where we're at right here is, we have just a laundry list of actions that we have to do that are sort of not characterized.
Hey, Steve, yeah, I can jump in on that. Dave probably has some experience too. Yeah, those are pretty standard projects. I wouldn't think that it'd be really difficult to get those through and to work with the Corps on that. And you might think about something along the lines of like a programmatic Section 7 determination, rather than trying to do a separate Section 7 for each boat ramp project, right, as they come up. Try to work through all of them as you do a Section 7 determination, and maybe get an authorization that lasts, say, 10 years or something like that. So you don't have to keep going back on an annual basis and thinking, oh, I need to have a Section 7 for this. That might be a way to approach it.
Awesome copy on that. Yeah, I'll leave the floor open for others because I could take up all your time. As you know, Kai, everything I know about wild and scenic rivers, I know from Kai Allen. So
Well, and you guys just got through a section 7 down there, Steve, associated with channelization and the mail boats and boat passage for those motorized boats down there. So, and I think that got signed just recently, I believe.
yeah, that's correct. Yeah, I was sort of on the sidelines looking at all that, and yeah, and I got a laundry list of 15 more.
Yeah, you're welcome to call anytime, Steve.
Appreciate it. I'll do that for sure. You guys are just a wealth of knowledge here.
Any other questions? Well, we've got a couple minutes left. I
Hey,
know.
I've got a question.
Yeah,
If
go ahead.
anybody else has a question, I've got a question for our audience. So what do you do if we talked about this standard, invade and unreasonably diminish those recreation, scenery, fish and wildlife values? And it's at the base, it's at the time of designation. And so what do you do if you don't know? Like, what do you do if you don't have a baseline determination from your river when it was designated back in 1982? How would you go about determining that? Any thoughts on that?
I've actually been over to the Historical Society and started prying up old photos and things like that on some situations for myself.
Yeah, going back and kind of like looking at the record. Old watershed analyses can be helpful. Maybe you reach out to your Fish and Wildlife Managing Agency, maybe could give you some trend information about fish and wildlife values or something like that. But it's something that often you may not be able to find in your comprehensive river management plan, particularly if those values weren't identified as outstandingly remarkable values. So if, say, wildlife wasn't an ORV, you might not find anything about it in your CRMP. If there's a project that triggers this invade and unreasonably diminished standard.
But for monitoring, if I can find anything that somebody else is doing on my streams, if the state's already doing it, I'm going to make that my monitoring. So I don't have to expel more money and resources. If somebody's doing something similar, I'm going to fall back on that as long as they're still doing it, and incorporate that into what I'm accomplishing instead of duplicating or almost duplicating what someone else is doing. But yeah, figuring out what other people are doing can save you a lot of time and money.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah, thanks. And yeah, lastly, what I would offer up to the audience is seek professional guidance. Section 7 can be pretty confusing, and there's always someone out there that knows the answer to your question or can help you, point you in the right direction. So and there's lots of great resources and folks out there. So feel free to lean on those resources. Talk to your regional, your state wild and scenic river coordinating your lead for your state or your regional office. It can be a wealth of assistance for you.
Just
That's
old
it.
river people.
Yeah, that's a
All right,
great
go.
point. No, I was just gonna say, calling on people, asking those who've done them, just again to highlight. I know earlier in the series we've talked about rivers.gov and some of the resources, but if you go to rivers.gov and then publications here in the middle, under the technical papers, there's actually an entire section 7 little section here. You can also find the white paper here on section 7 all the way towards the bottom, the second to last one. But you can find the flow chart here. You can find examples of determinations. Here's some here, depending on the type of project, bridge construction, stabilization, infrastructure. So just more great resources to check out. So, and just some final thoughts. Hope you join us next month on May 17th. We're going to be talking about bank stabilization techniques on wild and scenic rivers. I think it was maybe Dave who mentioned it earlier that bank stabilization is one of the more common Section 7s done. So we will be talking about kind of the intersection of that with bank stabilization with Section 7 and diving more into that. So hope to see you there. You can register and find the event on our website. So any final thoughts or from Kai or Dave?
No, thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you
Yeah,
all for
same.
coming. Yeah, and thanks to both of you. And again, I'll be sending this out to everyone, and feel free to get in touch and ask any other questions that you might have.
Thanks, Angie. Thanks, everyone.
Yep, thank you.